Right, well, afternoon, everyone. Hope you've had reasonable days and that the first few weeks back at school are going, well, best they can. I know there's lots and lots of things going on at the moment. And thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Hopefully this is a useful session, but we'll be asking for a bit of feedback on it. Sort of understanding the level of detail that we can go into on a webinar versus where we can go into afterwards. But hopefully this is a useful starting point. As Ben and I were talking about earlier, there's a lot of different routes to funding this year. Lots available, but all sort of slightly different in the way that they execute. So thanks very much for joining us. Just so you've got you're aware of how it works, we've got a Q&A function button on Zoom, so you can click onto there. So rather than the chat, if you wouldn't mind popping Q&A actual questions for Ben or myself into that chat box on Q&A. What we'll try and do is collate those and we'll ask them at the end of the session. So just so you've got a bit of a sense of it, and we will be recording this session. So if anyone you'd like to pass that on to, please feel free. So in terms of an agenda for today, we'll kick off by just giving a brief introduction to MyTutor and how we work and how funding appears to be laid out this year. We'll also look then at some online tutoring in practice. So we brought Ben Carter, who's an assistant head at Bohunt School Worthing, to give us some, I think best practice is probably fair to say, is it Ben? Around how to use tuition. Perfect. Well, best practice. I mean, you've been with us for a while and actually runs a great program at Bohunt School Worthing. So hopefully some useful in practice tips for how to run a tuition program. If you haven't already, I'm sure many of you are now a bit more familiar with it, with the launch of the NTP in the last year, but I'm sure plenty won't be as well. Last year was a crazy one. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A. So roughly 20 minutes per section. Don't feel free to just go for it for Q&A, and we'll come to those at the end. So in terms of speakers, that's me. I'm Director of Education Partnerships at MyTutor, but more importantly, we've got Ben here, who's Assistant Head at Bohunt School Worthing, and he'll be talking us through something in practice today, which is always a useful way to sort of conceptualize things beyond a bit of an explanation. But to start with, I will attempt to give a short explanation before we move on to the funding piece. So I think we know why we're here. The year is set up to be different again. Feels like no year is particularly the same, but particularly in the last couple of years, I think some of the things that we've seen that are coming out around the disadvantage gap is reopened for the first time in getting on for 20 years. We know that now we're trying to keep a lid on COVID at the moment in schools, but regardless of that, there's been 2 years of disruption for most children in the education system. And so there are pots of money designed to combat that, in part down to the sort of track towards tuition and using tuition either with your own teachers, with a provider in lots of different ways, but they are coming from lots of different angles. And so this is sort of an attempt at trying to reconcile some of those, so there's a bit of clarity in terms of how it can work in practice for your school. And that's why we're here today. In terms of who we are, just very quickly, I know that some of you already partner with us and looking for a bit of clarity on funding. Some of you might be new to this, but we are an online tuition provider that basically provides your students with one-to-one and 3-to-1 support. So we match your students with top university students, and the reasons for that are around, well, I'll come on to that, but it's primarily around that they're near peer and a good complement to what goes on in the school day. We focus on core subjects, but right from Key Stage 3 to 5. So we're a secondary provider primarily, focused on disadvantaged students. That's just been where it's always landed. Our goal as an organisation is to be able to provide tuition to those who wouldn't ordinarily have access. And that's historically been through pupil premium with schools, but increasingly it's through other means of that as well. And sessions are designed to fit around your students' lifestyles, timetables, and they're live, personalized and tailored. So I'll come on to that, but essentially the idea is by being online, students, you can have it at the time that suits you. That might be after school, that might be home. For most kids, it will be at some point during school, usually at the end of the day, but lots of people do it in lots of different ways. I think the main thing to note is from an impact perspective, we have an impact report that I'll send around to you if you're interested, but what we consistently find is that pupils make about 2.5 times the grade progress of their peers. So that's about a grade, which, given that most of our students are working towards passes and beyond, a grade can make quite a significant difference to their outcomes. And we know that that happens when they take about 10 sessions or so. So we don't typically do sort of 5 sessions and that kind of thing. We tend to do 10 or so. So a little bit about our tutors. They're all studying at university, top universities. We only accept 1 in 8. They have to go through one-to-one interviews. They go through a selection process through that, and then they also get put through I think it's an 18 module, might be more now, training program that we designed with Teach First and qualified teachers to make sure that, as well as being excellent, having top marks in their own studies, they're also able to communicate that to a student as and how they might need it. Once you've got a tutor that you know is good quality, you then have the other part about the fact that they've got recent exam experience and they can be near peer role models. And so hopefully those of you who have already worked with us for a while now have experienced that the idea that it's very much a complement to what goes on in the school day, never a replacement, because nothing can replace what's done in school by teachers, but it can certainly be a really successful boost to students that need a bit more personalized support and get it from a slightly different angle. In terms of what a session looks like, we have our lesson space, which is totally live. It's an interactive whiteboard. You can see that on the left. The idea is it's supposed to be a live one-to-one session, nothing recorded, nothing sort of preloaded, but it's based around the things that you believe your students need, which is really, really important. So you're able to upload resources as you need to make sure that the things that are being covered in maths, English, science, whatever, are in line with your QLA assessments, are in line with the sort of things that you have got planned for your students. And so our tutors aren't working in the dark, but also your pupils are getting exactly what they need. This is a little bit about your teacher portal. It's almost a bit more level of detail, but it's nice to see, I suppose. So when you work with us, I think that the point is, regardless of the size of a program, whether it's 7 in this example or 100, you get access to a teacher portal, which shows you at a glance attendance, engagement. You'll see tutors' weekly lesson reports, what's gone well, what could have gone better, what they're going to be focused on in the future. And it's also a good place for you to share assessment data and resources so that we're always making sure that what's being taught is in relation to what is needed. So that's a little bit about us, and happy to waffle on about that at a later stage. But I think the main thing to talk about today really is about, ahead of Ben's presentation, is about the funding that's currently available. What we've decided to do is give a bit of a high level overview in terms of these funding streams in particular. And there's levels of detail that sit below it, and some of it we can tackle in a Q&A. But we've studied the thing. It's important that we make sure we know what we're talking about. And so hopefully we can have, where you want more detail, really happy to share that. I'm really happy to talk through it. At a high level, we'll talk about the Schools-Led Tutoring Fund, the National Tutoring Programme, which is in its 2nd year, Schools-Led is in its 1st year. And then we'll also talk about the recovery premium, which you may or may not have heard about, but which is attached to pupil premium more generally. I'll just do a really quick shout out for 16 to 19 funding, just in case you do Key Stage 5 and you haven't spotted this. I think it went last year as well. But essentially, this covers primarily GCSE resits, but also some A-level stuff for economically disadvantaged students. You can spend it on your own staff to give extra support, or on things like a tuition provider like MyTutor. Typically can be used for small group or one-to-one. But I just wanted to flag it up. We'll share the form around, but if you haven't already applied, there's an application deadline of the 12th of October, which is super close. We tried looking for a secondary application deadline, weren't able to find one. If there is one, please do let us know. But in case you haven't applied for funding here, there is an opportunity to do that up until the 12th. That's the 16 to 19 thing. We'll go into a bit more detail on the other funds just now. So in terms of Key Stage 3 and 4, the tuition funds that are currently available sort of fit into these 3 brackets. So the first one is the Schools-Led Tutoring budget. Now, you may or may not have heard of this already. It's a new fund for this year, and it's due to last through for the next 3 years. Essentially, it was designed to provide a little bit more flexibility to schools who were familiar with the National Tutoring Programme before. And so whilst it's funded on a pupil premium funding formula. It's not a designated pupil premium pot. It's to be used for tuition, but can be done with your own teachers or tuition providers. So crucially, you've got that distinction. You're able to run it in a couple of different ways. Most of the schools that tend to utilize MyTutor do it because as much as they want to use their own teachers, sometimes it could be a capacity thing, but also the ability to have a slightly different perspective on tuition or complement there might be a reason why they'll do that. But both options are available. So essentially, the funding formula is that they fund what they deem as 75% of the cost of a tuition block for 60% of your pupil premium students. So what that boils down to is about £203 per pupil for 60% of your PP pupils. Now that grant is paid automatically in installments. The first one for academies is in October, the first one for local authority schools in September. It's paid in 3 installments. It's intended for pupil premium, but can be used for any student. Now, 15 weeks of tuition is advised. We tend to find that the impact is fairly similar for particularly for one-to-one tuition, whether it's 10 or 15 weeks. But 15 weeks is advised as part of this budget. Now, a student can study multiple subjects. There's no PP restrictions. But the purpose of this budget is that it's paid directly to the school, and if it's not used, it gets clawed back, as you might expect. In terms of reporting, there's a couple of things that are required. So we'll share around some guidance on that. But generally speaking, it sort of provides a slightly more flexible approach to last year's and this year's National Tutoring Programme. So that's one funding. And crucially, things to know are it goes directly to you. It's £203 per pupil for 60% of your PP students. And it is to be used for tuition, whether that's with your own teachers or tuition providers. That's up to you. The second fund is the National Tutoring Programme. Now, this might be one that you're more familiar with. It was in existence last year. There are a couple of distinctions this year, but the National Tutoring Programme is designed around using external tuition providers, which I think is one of the reasons why the School-Led Tutoring budget also came in as a complement. So what that's targeting is the other 40% of the pupil premium students at school. Rather than a grant that's paid directly to you, what happens is you pay 30% of the tuition cost when you're buying a program. So rather than having a pot of money and choosing to use that and using that towards tuition, you get the 70% discount applied when you purchase tuition. So there are a couple of caveats on this. So 15 weeks of tuition is mandated. So that's what they've asked that we work with in schools and other. Not a bad thing. One subject per pupil is a caveat worth noticing. So if you've got a student that needs a crossover grade, for example, in maths and in English, you might want to look down the School-Led Tutoring budget route for that part of the proposal. It's also, there's a restriction on pupil premium. So for some schools, this won't be a problem at all, but the average pupil premium percentage across the program should be 65%. So 65% of the students on a National Tutoring program should be 65% pupil premium. So again, the School-Led Tutoring budget in some ways complements that, because where your percentage isn't quite up to that number, you can use a blended approach and use both funding pots to be able to fund out something that you're doing. And I'll give you an example in a minute. For us, we're using the National Tutoring Programme as a 3-to-1 tuition program primarily, and the School-Led Tutoring budget as a 1-to-1 tuition program primarily. And that's partly just to simplify how it all looks, because there's lots of different pots available. So those are the 2 funding pots that are tuition specific. The last one, probably a bit more familiar to you, but we've got here pupil premium and recovery premium. So first of all, the first thing to note is catch-up premium. If you remember catch-up last year, there was a catch-up fund of £80 per pupil last year. Now, if you have any of that left from last year, you're able to use that this year. It has been carried forward. Some schools will go, absolutely not, none of that left. And some of you might have some of it left, but just as a caveat, any of that is available to spend this year. The recovery premium is a 145 per student boost for PP students. So where you get the ordinary £935 a student, you also get an extra £145 through the recovery premium. There's nothing to claim here. That gets paid in the usual way. They're just confirming the details on exactly how that works, but the assumption is that the recovery premium will be spent in much the same way as you use the pupil premium fund now. So you can use your own teachers, you can use your own tuition providers. It doesn't have to be used for tuition, it could be used for a range of initiatives. But what might be quite useful to know is you can use this to pay for a lot of the non-subsidized costs of other funds. So you could use this.
The details to make sure students have all the details. We are quite fortunate that we are a one-to-one iPad school. So all of our students have an iPad and they go home, they do their tutoring on their iPad. So I would oversee them. Literally, I've overseen 35, 40 students and watch them log in, watch them save their password on their phone, and also watch them take a screenshot of the email I sent them with their username and password. It's really important because obviously without that basic information, they can't do anything. If you move on to the next slide for me then, please, Richard. So the next thing then is just the day-to-day communications of it, which is really important because, you know, we expect students to take on these new changes really frequently, but ultimately we're asking them to do something unusual, something they've not done before, and it's really important they hit the ground running. So we have a member of our reception team downstairs who phones every parent every day, every time they have a session. We may stop doing that after 4 or 5 weeks. The kids that routinely attend, we might take them off our parental reminder list just because, you know, admin at school can be a bit mental. But students whose attendance is a bit up and down, students whose attendance relies a lot on parental support, we would remind them every week for 15 weeks or however long the session is. We then have tutors remind students in the mornings. So as soon as they come in, remember you've got tutoring at 4:30 this evening. Do you know what your password is? Yep. No, I don't know what my password is. Okay, Mr. Carter sent it to me. Here's your password, write that on your iPad. And a lot of the year 11 students that we have involved at the moment have mentors who are updated on their attendance. So again, it's just about how many voices can we get reminding them of these things, because for us as well, we've sort of discovered that once they get into it, they're generally like their apprehensions do leave quickly. Okay, like Richard said, having students that are only sort of 19, 20 does make them relatable, and it does, you know, once they get started, they are pretty keen. Do you want to move on to the next slide then, Richard? I've just seen I've got some questions pop up, but I'll just a sort of mini Q&A at the end before I pass back to Richard, perhaps, if that's okay. So this is just an example then of the sort of communications that we have. So on the left then, these are some notes that the admin team have made with me, for me, about who they spoke to in terms of the sessions today. So if they're off sick today, I can say, you know, sometimes I ring and say, are they sick? Are they really sick? In which case I'll mark them as absent on MyTutor, or are they, you know, too sick to walk into school? They could perhaps still push themselves for an hour of maths. And then on the right, this is just the email that I send to tutors. So again, it's obviously got a list of names that I've blanked out, a list of times, and a list of passwords. So, you know, we have some students who I think their tutor gives them their password every single week. Every single week, they take another photo of it. If you look back through their photo album, it's just a list of their password. It's the same photo every week for 15 weeks, but it ensures that they work. The next thing then, so you've got your program up and running, you've sorted out your communications, you've sorted out how you're going to talk to people, then you've got your monitoring of the attendance. So again, this is MyTutor do a really good job of providing that website where you've got a little green light for attended, a little red light for not attended. But for me and for us, it's important that we can see what patterns are developing. So for example, if you look at this pupil premium student at the top, I can see they haven't attended since the first week. So that would be me on the phone rather than an admin team to have a slightly more deeper, meaningful conversation going along the lines of, we want to give them this support, but they're not attending. And if they don't attend, the support isn't benefiting them. So therefore we might take it away from them and give it to someone else. You can see at the bottom, I've got a little P there for a student that had a hospital appointment. So again, I can see what's happening. Sometimes the frustrating thing is a student will tell you they've got a hospital appointment on the day of their session. So I can let my tutor know that they won't be attending that session. As soon as I know that, but it still means sadly that session gets lost because obviously their tutor's in place and things like that, which it's good for us to know how committed the student is and whether they're missing sessions because they can't be bothered or whether they've got legitimate reasons. But obviously we always encourage parents and students to let us know as soon as possible. So once you've got that all up and running, you've got your attendance, you've got your monitoring, the next thing then really is just to make sure your attendance is as good as possible, because ultimately you're a bit balanced. And this is where your attendance, like I spoke at the start about how we've got an overall attendance of 80%. You can almost decide what you want your attendance to be, because if we wanted our attendance to be 100%, I could pick 30 kids with outstanding attitudes to learning who are making reasonable progress, and I could jump them from 4s to 6s despite their target being a 4, and I could get 100% and we can all pat ourselves on the back. However, morally, are we helping those students that need that help? And if we are, the frustrating part is that often the students who need that help are the students who are not always as receptive as others to receiving it. So it does mean that attendance won't be perfect. So you need to take that on the chin. You need to look at that. What we always talk about here is last year the finances worked out that we were paying £20 a session. If we get 80% attendance, then we're paying £24 a session, which is still really good value for money. So we can legitimately say, okay, we're paying £24 for this person to receive 14 sessions rather than 15, and that's okay. The key to ensuring good attendance, though, is that make sure parents and students are well informed. The frustrating thing is, don't assume that parents will talk to their own children. If you say to parents, let your kid know, they'll go, oh yeah, I'll text him. Don't assume that ever happens. The frustrating part is that sometimes parents, with the best will in the world, you know, a lot of our parents that we support here work really long hours, so they don't see their kids until their session is well out of the way, because they get home at 7 and the kids' session was at 5 o'clock. Don't accept poor attendance is another thing. Again, we have been a bit stung on this. We've had students who make a different excuse every week, but then they miss 4 weeks in a row. And it means that of a 15-week program, they limit themselves to only 8 or 9 possible weeks. So you need to have reserves ready to go at short notice. And here, our experience is there is a bit of a balancing act between starting off with our hardest to reach students, and then maybe when some of those hardest to reach students, sadly, we don't manage to reach them to a level we're happy with, get replaced with students that can step in at the last minute, can free up some time for us to focus on those students that really need our support. And if you're aiming for, 10, 15 weeks of sessions, if students have missed 2 sessions in a row, that would trigger a phone call from myself or their head of house rather than an admin team. If they miss 3 sessions out of 4, or every other session for 2 or 3 weeks, then again, that steps up quite quickly. It's important, I think, that you've got a system in place that ramps up the sort of who is ringing them, because they know if reception's ringing them, that's one thing. But if you ring up and say, I'm in charge of this program, I'm an assistant head teacher, then obviously you can have more meaningful conversations. And the sad reality is that sometimes you will need to replace people because for whatever reason they can't do that. And as I say to parents, we're not giving up on them. We're just looking for a different way to support them. And obviously we carry on putting things in place. And then for us, attendance is our biggest marker of success. So we obviously track attendance, like I've shown you. We then track how their projected grade changes. We then track how their attainment changes. But for us, for this, attendance is our biggest success criteria, because if they are attending, they are doing what they can. They are fulfilling their part of the agreement. Because if they attend all 15, then attainment will absolutely come. We haven't got any students, I don't think, that had 90+% attendance who didn't make positive gains at the end. So if you can celebrate that attendance, we've got year 7s who've got assemblies and big certificates, presentations. The year 11s, we did the odd sort of pizza evening and things to try and just get those celebrating it. We did some Amazon draws where we gave out Amazon vouchers. Year 11s aren't as big on certificates and assembly, but there are other things that can still drive them forward. So that's all from me. I think I saw one question that was just, were all sessions done at home? So we tried a few different methods. During lockdown, when everyone was at home, we did some sessions during PE lessons, because lockdown PE was a bit of a tricky thing to do. When those people come back to school, we still did their sessions during their PE time. But this year, and in programs that haven't been interrupted by lockdown, we have run all of our programs at home. We played with a model where we did a few sessions in school, again replacing PE lessons or PSRE, but after 3 weeks of in school, we would then transition to doing them at home. We found that was not our best model, because that transition became quite messy. That transition meant that people would then miss a few sessions because they were not clear that it had transition. So again, no matter how much you tell parents, obviously asking them to do something completely new they've not done before is really challenging. So for us, just being really clear and saying, this will happen at home, you are partly responsible for ensuring your child attends it right from the get-go, is by far and away the best thing. We've filmed some videos about this is how you log in, so we don't need that over their shoulder for the first time. And like I said, we get them logged in without a session. We just get them logged in tutor time or something. I think that's all from me, from what I've got prepared. So I think I'm back over to Richard.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Ben, for that presentation. Really comprehensive and loads of good stuff in it. Just so you folks are aware who are listening in the Q&A box, if you popped a question in there, do you mind putting it in the chat? For whatever reason, Zoom is not interested in me clicking on the Q&A button to see what those questions are, unless you can see them, Ben.
I've got the Q&As.
Well, then you're running the show.
Okay. So do you want me to read out the Q&As? Some I think I can answer, and some will probably absolutely better for you because they're about funding.
Good. Well, I think shoot for yours first.
Okay. So one of the questions here is, do you think going twice a week for 5 weeks is better than once a week for 10? So I think it depends on your objective. So we have done both. At the moment, we are in the middle of a twice a week for 5 week program. And we've already had actually some students say, can I just do it once a week for 10? Because they work part-time and they've got to do other lessons. But it depends. So for us, our twice a week for 5 weeks is a sort of mock booster where the head of English, the head of maths and myself have put together like a mock program of 10 hours. But if it's just about sort of supporting lessons, then I would suggest maybe once a week for 10 or 15 weeks is probably a bit more manageable. And it means as well, you've got your cohort spread over, so you can probably manage a larger cohort once a week, because you're only, if you've got a cohort of 30, you're making 30 phone calls a week. Whereas if you're doing it twice a week, then you're making 60 phone calls a week. I think all the rest of the questions are about funding. So I'll just read them out, Richard, and hand over to you.
Sure.
So our first question is, in the school-led tutoring and pupil/recovery premium pots, where we could use our own teachers or tuition providers, is it the case that our tutors have to complete the DFE approved training if they do not have QTS?
So as far as I'm aware, I think I can tell Dr. Robertson, thank you for posting it as well in the chat. As far as we're aware, yes is the answer to that. That's due to be launched in November. That's the only shame at the moment, is that it's not ready right now, and so that puts a bit of a delay on it where you want to use your own teachers, but that is coming. For tuition providers perspective, the training provided for those tutors is deemed relevant to this, and so they don't have to complete that training. So you could even look to do something where you start something in one way and then move on to your own tutors when they've had a chance to complete the training.
Grant. Next question is, NTP could target only PPs?
So good question. So NTP targets, it's very focused on PP. 65% is the threshold it asks for. 65% is the number to target there, whereas the other funds are like PP and disadvantage is obviously the focus, but we know that disadvantage spreads across a wider range than that.
Grant. And then, is it a requirement that NTP is 3-to-1 and schools-led funding is 1-to-1, or can you use 1-to-1 throughout if you so wish?
Oh, Ben, would you mind repeating that? Sorry.
Not at all. Is it a requirement that NTP is 3-to-1 and schools-led funding is 1-to-1, or can you use 1-to-1 throughout if you so wish?
Good question. So for the NTP, 1-to-1 is permitted for SEN students. So that's where that comes into play. For schools-led, it's more up to you. 3-to-1's encouraged, but it's more up to you in that respect. I hope that answers the question there.
I assume so. Can I just add something actually about our experience of 3-to-1 and 1-to-1? We found that with the best will in the world, whatever you did, you needed to have quite a degree of flexibility. Students would have appointments that would mean you'd move it from a Monday to a Tuesday. Students would have, like we had open evening, for example, last week, which meant that all of our sessions on a Thursday had to be cancelled. With 1-to-1, that manoeuvrability is fairly straightforward. Like MyTutor school support are really good actually at moving sessions for you at sort of a few, well, if you give them 1 or 2 days notice, then they'll get back to you and confirm that it's done within the hour usually. The 3-to-1 sessions, because you've got to coordinate 3 families and 3 students, I mean, that flexibility isn't there as much. So our 3-to-1 program we did in school with year 7, and that worked very well because obviously all 3 of those students are in school. When we transitioned some 3-to-1 programs to outside of school, we then meant, especially because like clubs restarted and things because of things that were cancelled by COVID restarted, it meant that sometimes our 3-to-1 sessions only became 2-to-1 because the third person could never attend because they were now back to doing basketball on a Thursday, for example. So the 3-to-1 is obviously a lot cheaper and a lot more economical, but the lack of flexibility is something that that is worth definitely considering.
And I think to that point, Ben, I think last year that was certainly the case. I think with the schools-led tuition fund, it sort of doesn't level out, but it certainly comes closer than it did last year, where there was no explicit subsidy for that side of things. So it's worth drawing out for sure. I've got a couple here in the chat that I think are worthwhile. I think one from NF, which was, well, it might relate to me, but I think it will probably, the start of the question would go for you, Ben, which is about, did you communicate specific content to the tutors that you'd like to be delivered? Or did you allow tutors to decide the starting points? And I assume that's how you decided to proceed with that. So what did you do?
So when you fill in your form saying who you've got and when you want their sessions, there is a box that says, what would you like these guys to work on? Where you can be as detailed or as undetailed as you want. What we did for this round actually, and what I think we're going to do for future, is we were quite prescriptive in what we wanted. So the head of English and head of maths wrote like a sort of 10-session program that would link really tightly to mock exams. Like I said, our focus really is to make sure kids who have been frequently unsuccessful in exams taste a bit of success in their upcoming mocks to make them more self-motivated to revise independently. So we were quite prescriptive in that. We even got to the point where we added some documents, like some worksheets that we would expect them to work on. For example, by the end of this hour, we would like students to be able to work their way through this worksheet fairly independently, just so we could give tutors a really clear idea. And that, I think, works well. My understanding is you can be as open or as closed as you want, but for us, especially with year 11, that closedness, I think, helped us with what we were trying to achieve.
Yeah, I would say, please do provide that information, because I think not all schools do provide it. And those that do, I think we always see it's better because the tutors can focus in right from the very beginning. And some flexibility around if something else comes up or whatever else. But actually the idea is, if we can tie it as closely to what teachers know that students need, the better, from our perspective. So having a look at this, I know C1B, you made an observation around doing it during PE, doing tuition during PE last year. And that's always a bone of contention, because I think it works really well in some respects, but it works, and it really can be, a shame for students in some respects because they want to do PE. Just so you've got a sense of it, and I have no preference on, well, I mean, I think what we know is that it should never replace a subject or anything like that. It's sort of like, for example, if you want to do math, it should never replace maths, obviously. What I can tell you is that our most concentrated periods for tuition tends to be in that 2 to 4 to 5 p.m. window, where students might still be at school, but they're in an IT room at the end of the day, which I think, Ben, you mentioned you did with some of your cohorts for 3-to-1. So, at home works where you can make sure you're motivating those students and you're picking the right ones. And then at the end of the school day tends to be quite a popular one as well. And I know there's lots going on for year 11s and everything else in that period.
So we have, sorry.
Go on, Ben, you go.
So yeah, you're right. We ran some sessions in PE. And the key there really is to make sure you've got a really good understanding with your PE teachers. Like, so me and the head of PE would have lots of conversations about what students will be where, how long they're going to be out of PE for. Because if you can get that support from the PE department, and you get to a point where PE are telling them to go away from PE and into tutoring, then that works well. If you get a bit of a disconnect there and the kids sort of sneak into PE, then yeah, obviously that can be frustrating, because like you say, sometimes you've got students who quite enjoy a bit of PE, which is nice for them, but it does mean they miss out on what you've put in place for them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Encore, you mentioned, is there a recommended standard rate per hour for schools-led tutoring if you recruit your own professional tutors? So I think what we like to say is that the funding formula is based on the idea that they fund 75% of an £18 an hour rate for tuition. So I think it assumes 3-to-1 tuition at about, what is that? At about £54 an hour. That's what it assumes for I think for a 3-to-1. It's quite cheap for a 1-to-1 piece. So they will fund up to £13.50 an hour for school-led tuition per student. But they base that formula off £18 an hour, which I think is probably too low for 1-to-1, but sort of fits roughly in line maybe with 3-to-1. So somewhere on that range would make sense. Just so you know that if you recruit for lower than £18 an hour, the government claw that money back at the end of the year. So there's not necessarily a massive incentive to go much lower. But that's just a couple of thoughts there. Katie asks, is the NTP 1-to-1 available for LAC? My understanding is that for the most part, I think we did plenty of LAC 1-to-1 as part of the NTP, but that may have been due to overlap with SEN. So I will double check that for you, Katie, just to make sure and make sure you've got a good sense of that. I know you also mentioned there about sharing content lists with tutors, but who prepares the materials? That's a good question. So there's a couple of ways in which that works. So our tutors primarily, they're trained fully in how to deliver lessons and on the curriculum. They're given a bank of resources to use and they can innovate on those as they see fit. But also we allow teachers to upload their own resources. And so where that feels additionally useful, you're more than welcome to do that. But for the most part, the resources that already exist and the training that's provided to our tutors seems to go fairly well overall. Oh, Tom, thank you. That's very useful. So hopefully that sort of helps with the question there on the funding part. No worries, Katie. So we've got a couple of minutes, which just means we're all very on time, and that's very excellent. I don't know if anyone else had any other burning questions they were dying to say.
Sorry, there's another question here on the Q&A.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
When using either of these funding methods, is there anything we need to complete, or do we simply organise tutoring through MyTutor and tell them if it's NTP or not?
Then I'm going to ask you to repeat that one more time.
So when using either of the funding methods,
yeah,
is there anything that staff need to complete, or do we simply organise tutoring through MyTutor and tell them if it's NTP or not?
So yeah, so there's a couple of things. So first of all, we can organise tuition on our end. From a schools-led tutoring fund perspective, there's a return at the end of the year to say which students you supported, how much it cost, and sort of make that report back. And there's a form that's I don't know if it's already live or going live that will speak to that, but it's in 2022. From a National Tutoring Programme perspective, we are once you've registered and gotten everything started, we're working it out with Randstad at the moment, the NTP, to work out whether we need to ask you to register on the website for the NTP, just to confirm that finally. But for the most part, we can work it out just directly with us. So don't feel like you have to go anywhere else. You're happy to speak to us, and we can all get that all confirmed for you. C1B, the 65% PP for the NTP is new this year. Yes, it is. I think it was in part a reaction to, I think the average was 45% last year. It depends on your perspective. I think that, you know, disadvantage can be spread much more broadly than pupil premium. But I think the addition of the schools-led funding has been really helpful there in terms of being able to widen that remit, and so that you don't feel like if you've got less PP, but they're still disadvantaged, they can't get access to tuition. I think it was important, if this was implemented, to be able to provide another funding formula for those students. So yes, it is new for this year as a thing, and we'll see how that changes through the year. But for now, that's what it is. So I think we're at 5 o'clock now. So I think we're at time for today. If there is a spare question, I might sort of just ask that it's copied into the chat group, and I can follow it up separately. But thank you very much for joining the session this evening. I know you've probably all had busy days anyway. It's lovely to see you all. Hopefully that provided some useful input. If there's anything else you wanted to reach out to us about, my email's just here, richard@mytutor.co.uk, hopefully nice and easy. And we'll also send up a follow-up with the contents from this session, and also Ben's slides and things. And if Ben's happy for people to get in contact with you, I'll also share those details. But Ben, I won't put you on the spot right now, although thumbs up is good.
Fine. I've just got one more question here. Have you identified, this is for me, have you identified all your pupils on the census? How have you done this? Have you used the criteria you explained earlier? Well, I'm not sure what you mean by identified all your pupils on the census. So yeah, the criteria we use is usually the criteria I explained earlier, where we look at PP 3 to 4 students that are under target. Like I said, depending upon what the aims of our project are, would depend upon how we use the criteria to identify the students that we're going to use. I'm not sure what you mean by identified all your pupils on the census. Feel free to. Oh, okay. Requirement from the DFE in their guidance. So yeah, so I think when we use NTP funding, we have to give their UPN number and like proper details. When we use different funding, we don't have to use their UPN number and things. So yeah, where we identify them on the census, we give MyTutor their UPN numbers so they can identify them, presumably in some official capacity.
And the school census piece is, because the schools-led tuition piece is new this year. That will be new as well, and probably not something you've how it works with the schools-led tuition piece will probably be fairly new to you anyway, Ben. So, and also on all of us. I think it was actually a good article in TES a couple of days ago that I'll share around as well, that might sort of explain that a bit better. Okay, lovely. Well, look, thank you all so much. Have lovely evenings. My email's here in case you want to get in touch with myself, and we'll share around a bit more of this. Please do share it around with others if you think they benefit from it as well. I'd be more than welcome, and hopefully it provides a little bit of insight. I know it's quite a complicated world, but the upshot is that there's money available for tutoring, however you choose to deploy it, and hopefully it's really helpful for your students this year. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely evening. See you later.